therein lays the problem. The death and destruction and body bags and blood and guts and trips here and there and stuff going on and the bullshit and everything is normal. Just after I was left, the bloody mortar came down through my bloody roof, went straight through the middle of my floor without going off. The company itself had a lot of difficulty in Bearcat with heroin, Red Rock, and there was a lot of fairly high usage of heroin. You know, one day there's a pilot there, next day he's gone. They go, what happened to him? Drugs. Gone. What am I going to say? You're not allowed to carry rockets at night for the NVA? Tell them Andy said. Oh yeah, that'll be right. G'day. What? Andy said I'm not allowed to carry rockets tonight. Yeah, right, yeah. You know, blokes get on and say, oh, we're going to go out and kill some people. Oh yeah, how are we going to do that? Watch this. And you do. And with a pallet of bloody or any pallet of Australian beer, you can buy anything. Anything.
Andy, can you give us an overall summary of your life so far?
No. That's in 25 words or less. No. Summary of life. Born in Tasmania, in the mountains. Son of a soldier settler. Grew up out of a little place called Watamana. Initially schooled at home. Eventually, at the age of 7, sent to a boarding school, Friends School in Hobart. A boarder for about 4 years, till my father got too sick to continue on the property, and we moved to Hobart briefly, then to Blackmans Bay, then we eventually settled in Kettering down the D'Entrecasteaux Channel, and at that stage I discovered boats, and I think that's been a major part of my life ever since, and was the major reason why I joined the Navy rather than the Air Force. The other reason was that having applied for both the Navy and the Air Force, the Navy were the first to accept me, and so I was very happy to be able to be at sea and fly, because I wanted to fly and be a pilot since I was about 6 years old. I decided that was what I was going to be, and in fact from then on everything I did went towards that goal. It was only, of course, later in life, later in my young life, that I realised that I'd have to join the military if I wanted to learn how to fly, because the costs of learning to fly were high, probably higher back then than they are now in comparison. And my family had no money, so I was considering doing it in the Navy, or in the military, put it that way. Yeah. The military was an obvious choice for somebody who was brought up in a family where the father's military service was a prominent part of his past, and also my grandfather was military. So it was a fairly easy decision to come to think about joining the military. Yeah. I joined the military shortly before my 18th birthday. I had applied the year earlier, but they'd changed the criteria, and they said to reapply in another year, which is what I did. Midshipman training at Point Cook, went to sea on HMAS Anzac whilst waiting for a position to open in the flight course in the Royal Australian Air Force. The Navy had been sending trainee pilots to United States Navy, Pensacola, but they'd stopped doing that in 66, I believe. So yeah, I was just waiting for a course, and I eventually got on 67 course in 67. That's important because any pilot who's any ex-military pilot or military pilot in this country determines their seniority on basically on what military, of course, all advancement is on seniority. But even after you get out, in discussion amongst ex-military pilots, the first thing you ask is, what course were you on? Hence, 67 course. They're up to 200 and something now. Yeah, anyway, that was 67 course, Point Cook, then Pearce, Western Australia, back to the Navy then at Royal Australian Naval Air Station, HMAS Albatross at Nowra. Transition on to helicopters. 1969 that was, beginning of 69, end of 69 I went to Vietnam with the 3rd contingent. I didn't go there initially with them. I was the 1st reserve, and one of the pilots was shot and returned to Australia to recuperate, and I went up in his place after that. He eventually came back to Vietnam after he recuperated. So then we returned, the 3rd contingent returned in 1970, October, and October 1970 wasn't a very good time for a Vietnam veteran in this country, and it wasn't a very good time for a Vietnam veteran in the Royal Australian Navy for that matter. And so I made an effort then to get out of the Navy, but to continue flying. So I made approaches to helicopter companies, to civilian helicopter companies. I was eventually allowed to leave the Navy in about September or October 1971. Yeah, I was about a year back in Australia before I could get out. The Navy initially didn't want me to leave, but made no attempt to make my life in the Navy any easier, and thereby induced me to stay. There was a lot of politicking, and there was a lot of stuff going on in the Navy. Because there were so few Vietnam veterans in the Navy, and I'm talking about the Fleet Air Arm now, we're a very small group that, for the time, made somewhat of a large splash. And I think there was a lot of senior people in the Navy who didn't particularly appreciate the splash that a lot of very junior people made. the Navy's was, I don't know what it's like now, very traditionally set up, and the old boy network is alive and well, and you know, the saying that back in my day we didn't have numbers, we all knew each other, is probably still true. The fact is that everybody knows who you are, everybody knows what you've done, good or bad. Everybody's got an opinion about it, and if you're the lowest on the pecking order and you want to do something and they don't like you, that's it. You're destined forever to be shuffled sideways. And that's pretty much what happened to me. So anyway, I got out of the Navy and went flying for the civilians. Initially a job in Australia for a reserve Navy pilot who actually, again, because of the people he knew and the fact that he was who he was, could finagle his way into war service. He could do his yearly reservist flying in Vietnam without having to go through all the workups, without having to go through all the indoctrination training, Canungra, all that stuff that we went through that was absolutely important before we could go to Vietnam. No, this old boy, he could just show up, you know, hang a gong on his chest, go home. So I went to work for him. A delightful gentleman, because he walked around up there saying, when you get out of this mess, you know, come and work for me. As you do, yeah. And then I went back to Southeast Asia, Papua New Guinea, worked out of Singapore, and continued my career in aviation for a short while. About 20 years ago, it all got too hard and too messy and too difficult and too... basically I blew all my fuses and had to retire. Couldn't do it anymore, overstressed. Retired to the jungle in North Queensland for years. And it was only when things got really bad there that my wife talked me into talking to people in the Vietnam Veterans Counselling Service. Got me out of the jungle, got me back somewhat into circulation. Old friends would call and say to me, you know, I thought you were dead. For a while there I probably was, so to speak. But yeah, and now I live in Townsville.
Can I just ask you though, your interest in planes from a very young age, was that something to do with what you read at the time, or the Second World War, or?
No, that was all to do with sitting on a horse behind 500 or 600 sheep, you know, tasting the stuff. And in those days the aircraft were DC-3s that were the passenger planes, and they flew between Hobart and Launceston and Melbourne. It was a fair old trip in those days, but it was also low level, and they used to fly down in front of the homestead in the valley in front of us, you know, and I'd look up and I'd think, far out, it's got to be better than what I'm doing. And my first reading adventures were Battle of Britain comics, you know, and books, and Sir Douglas Bader and Paul Brickell have got a lot to answer for, you know. You know, when I got into the military and I found that they weren't flying Spitfires, I was devastated. Which is why I never became a jet pilot, I think. So, as long as I had something turning and burning, you were right. Yeah, no, seriously, I looked up and I thought, it's got to be the way to go, eh? And like I said, I got involved with reading all this Douglas Bader stuff. Oh, I just loved it.
What was your group of reasons to join? I mean, obviously you had a love affair with the sea and boats and ships. You've talked about that in terms of joining the Navy, but
Yeah.
were you also keen to, did some of it have something to do with communism, what was actually happening, and Vietnam in general? Were you looking for a career in the Navy instead?
Well, I think when I started out, I must have been looking for some kind of career in the Navy. Having said that, I was only on a short-term enlistment. I was a supplementary list executive officer, brackets P, which means I was in for my training plus 7 years. I can't tell you that I really had any long-term plans, and I don't think that there's very many. I don't think that in the 60s there was too many teenagers who had long-term plans about anything. You know, like I had this, I want to be a pilot, I'm going to join the Navy, yahoo. And the rest of it, you know, let the cards fall where they may. And I think that's pretty much the attitude of most young people. I mean, you have a general idea about what you want to do, but you can't allow yourself to be too specific, because what if it doesn't work out, you know, and you get shuffled off in another direction? You just got to sort of have this idea of what you want to do. I'm sure there's people out there that know specifically, but I didn't.
So Andy, can you tell us about your actual enlistment? What was involved,
I don't remember a great deal about it. I remember going to Victoria. Initially, everything was done in Hobart, but then, you know, the second step was to go to Victoria and medicals and, you know, stuff. I can't remember a lot about it. Next thing I was sort of, you know, there you are, jump right in, and I think there was that much going on for this Tasmanian hick, you know, Melbourne, you know, wow, trams, trains, all that stuff, shops with lights. Yeah, oh look, Tasmania was a very, very quiet place. And suddenly Melbourne, Western Port. I was 17 when I got there, just before my 18th birthday, but I was 17. But a 17-year-old from Tasmania, you know.
Now that was your initial training when you went into the Navy, is that right? At Cerberus?
HMO Cerberus, Crib Point.
Okay. Now, is that what they call the rookie training, the very basic training?
Rookies, that's American. This was midshipman training. I went in as a midshipman, which is an officer trainee. In the Navy, a midshipman he doesn't have a commission, but he has officer status. I can't remember how it all works. Unlike the Air Force, where the cadets were all, Air Force cadets have no status. They're lower than anything. For instance, when I got into trouble at the Air Force base, they charged me and confined me to the barracks and with kitchen duties and stuff like that. And this was in the absence of the senior naval officer. And each one of these Air Force bases had a senior naval officer whose duty was just to be the overseer of all these midshipmen and basically be the boss, the Navy boss, if you will. When he came back to Point Cook, he was absolutely aghast, because you can't charge an officer. You have to have the full thing, the full. For lower ranks, you just front and centre charge them, you know, give them the fine, whatever, and away you go. But for officers, you've got to have court-martial. You have to go the full court-martial. I mean, you can have like disciplinary little, you know, tap on the wrist and stuff like that, but if you can't just charge an officer. You've got to have a court-martial. And so the Air Force had done this unspeakable thing, and of course the paperwork had to be rescinded and so on and so forth, and once more I was an embarrassment. But anyway, I don't know how we got there, but midshipman training. And the midshipman training is all junior officers, midshipmen, all go to Cerberus and all do this course. Out of that course, some will have joined to go on to flight training, some will go on to observer training, some will go on to, you know, all these other areas, seamen, supply officers, all that sort of thing. And I think there was sort of 30 or so of us who went to Cerberus in February '67, and I think there was, of the sort of Fleet Air Arm contingent, there was 5 or 8 pilot trainees, if you wish, which gives you an idea of how many of the process to that point, because for any intake there'd be, you know, several thousand people, but they whittle you down until there's only literally a handful of people who they accept. And my understanding is the system hasn't changed. They still out of those thousands just take that many, because they can. Yeah, that course goes on for, I can't remember how long, 3 months or 4 months or something like that. And then you go from Cerberus to whichever branch you're going to be assigned to.
Excuse me.
In my particular case, the guys I was with that got accepted, because the Air Force was only accepting 2 or 3 or 4 to go on their flight course, a few went, and that was 65 course, flight course. We were posted, the rest of us were posted to HMAS Anzac, which was a battle class destroyer, and we went to that ship in Sydney, and our first cruise was to Tonga for for the coronation of the King in October, and we were the naval Australian government's representative. We went over there and flew the flag and fired the guns, and actually all the guns didn't fire because we went through a cyclone which wet everything down. We lost a lot of stuff off the ship. It was a big cyclone, and it wet everything. So our 21 gun salute was a bit 16ish, I think. But yeah, I met John Gorton there. Yeah, interesting old boy. Didn't mind a party. So that was our first cruise.
The training at Cerberus, was that something that you were expecting, or was it a lot harder than you originally thought?
Well, again, I got to go back to I was 17 when I put my hand up. No idea what we were getting into, what I was getting into. So as for harder than I expected, I didn't expect anything, I don't think. I didn't know what to expect. No, I don't think I had any preconceived ideas about what was going to happen. And I got there and like, it was just whatever, it just all went on around me, you know, and I just tried to fit in as best I could. I couldn't march. And this is in a time when most schools had cadets and, you know, full-on big cadet companies and stuff like that, you know. Other schools in Hobart had cadets, but of course Friends, you know, Peace Corps, but not cadets. Peace Corps wasn't invented then either. But no, we had, Friends was into AFS students and American Field Service. We had, Friends was a big into swapping students, and the AFS was well entrenched in Friends. We had lots of students from Asia, with borders there. Lots of Asian students. People would send their kids from Bangkok and Hong Kong and, you know, Singapore, all over. They've heard about Friends School and their kids are going to go there, and they could afford it. So that's what they were into. So when I get there and they're teaching me how to march, you know, I dodoed for days. When you go by the left, by the right, whatever, quick march, you always step off with your left foot and your right arm. But I used to go left foot, left arm. It looks really weird when you're doing it and you fall over and stuff. But I had no idea. Weapons training, all that sort of stuff, you know, like I had no idea. I mean, I'd used my father's .22 rifle, but he didn't even like me to touch that. Guns, don't want to have anything to do with them. You're better off having nothing to do. So a whole lot of it was a huge eye-opener to me.
But you weren't, excuse me, when you were given the weapons to train on, you weren't given an old .22, were you? I mean, and that's what your father had. What guns were you given?
Weapons. Weapons instruction was on Thompson machine guns. Thompsons. God.
What are they? Are they really old?
Elliot Ness?
Pardon?
You remember Elliot Ness with the round Thompson machine guns? They've been around since the Dead Sea was crook. really old weapons. They did have the SLR, L1A1s, which was the standard army issue. We fired them, and 38 revolvers. But we were trained on what the Navy had on their ships. And interestingly enough, the training was specific to quelling riots, insurrections and such like, you know. Basically, you're a ship's officer, you take a party of men and you're in charge, an armed party ashore, and the mob's coming at you. These are the weapons you're going to use, and this is how you will. That was the training, because that's what you are, a naval officer on a ship, and the only time you're going to use any of this stuff is in those situations, you know, going ashore from a ship to stop the rabble from overcoming the embassy, for instance. And you've got to form a line in front of the embassy. And, you know, that's the sort of training we went to classes and this is how you and stuff. And
does it come from the old British tradition or something?
Everything is old British. I don't know what they're doing now, but it wouldn't surprise me that it's still RN, old boy, Royal Navy. Everything was RN. I mean, they got RN instructors, you know, RN flight instructors. So it's all, there's a lot of more, there's toing and froing to the Americans as well. But when I was there, most of the flight instructors on the 725 Squadron were RNers, Royal Navy. And all their thinking comes from the Royal Navy, you know. Like when I'm describing, you know, going ashore with all, I mean, it's right out of the
19th century.
Boxer Rebellion and all that sort of thing, you know. Puttees on and up the street you go, you know. Aden. It's all that march ashore and put down the insurrection, old boy. Oh, it must have worked. The British had a fabulous empire there for a little while, didn't they? They must have put down a few insurrections with a midshipman in front of
Yeah, they did
a couple of dozen startled sailors.
Yeah, they did have a little empire there for a while.
They did have a little empire, yeah. And yeah, I'm sure that there was midshipmen that were, like I say, standing in front, you know. God, the mind boggles, doesn't it?
Well,
that was all that. That's the initial training, you know, Navy. It's all Navy. We did Morse code and we did all of that sort of stuff. You did NBCD courses, nuclear, biological, something, you know, where they had mock-up ship there where they could pour water into compartments and you stop the water from coming in. And the smoke, and you do gas masks, and it's about being a ship's officer, and that's what they're training. Because above all, and this is what the Navy's always maintained, above all, you're a naval officer, and so your training is as a junior naval officer. What comes after that, you get this core training though. And you come back to that. If you want to stay in the Navy, then you have to go back to being a seaman officer and get your watch-keeping ticket and all that sort of thing.
It all sounds so British.
Well, it is British. Exactly.
We'll talk about more of that later, but I'm just going to ask you here if there was anything you excelled in at Cerberus. Was there something, seamanship or weaponry, that you were better at?
No. In fact, the whole time during my training, I didn't excel at anything. Nothing. In fact, I was a very marginal individual, just making the grade. Everywhere I went, I just made the grade. It became worse when I started my flight training, because every year one of the flight courses gets all the graduates from the Air Force Academy. Doesn't happen, I don't know how it happens now, but in those days you all went to Point Cook, and that's where the Air Force Academy was. And so one course every year would get all these Bachelor of Science degree holders. And the system of marking on course, it's got a name. I can't remember what the name of it is, but essentially it goes like this. You all do a test. They select the pass mark after all the results come in, so that, let's give it for instance, you do a test. Everybody gets 90% to 99%. So the pass mark will be 92. Regardless of how good you went, those at the very bottom have to fail. It's set like that. If we'd all got 50 to 60, then, like, again, the same thing. You have to fail. And if you fail enough times, you get scrubbed off course. That's just in the academic side. So if you're a lowbrow Tasmanian from the backwoods, and you've suddenly hit the big time, the bright lights, and you're on course trying to keep up with a bunch of university graduates who are all older than you. In fact, the whole course is older than you, other than one other bloke. You're the youngest bloke there. I was extremely mediocre. And in fact, they continue to tell me so regularly. I made it, just. But that's their system. Indeed, the system was working so well that all these people were getting scrubbed off course. And of course, the later you get scrubbed off, the more money that the government spent on you to get to that stage, which is a bit of a worry. So the government, in its wisdom, sent around these consultants who must have cost a couple of flight courses all by themselves to interview all the people on course to find out why so many people were getting scrubbed off. So what part of somebody's got to fail didn't they understand?
So once your Cerberus training had been completed and they put you on the Anzac destroyer, what did they expect of you then? What did they say? Okay, well you can go on the guns, or
I was local gun direction officer G6, which is just I couldn't even point to it. I imagine that I must have been able to then, but we never did anything with it. I mean, it was just a gun down the back, a 40-60 Bofors gun, not one of them big ones with the turret. Which meant, I suppose, you know, in times of action stations, I got to run down there with my tin hat and my flash, you know, the flash shield thing, the grey bit that you pull over your head, and your gloves and everything, and stand there, and I'm in charge of that gun. The destroyer was in fact a training ship. We learned more seamanship. We learned astro navigation. We learned lots about how a ship runs. We were involved in RASs, refuel at sea, where two ships run up alongside each other and you run a line across between them, and you run everything comes across on a little people and munitions and stores and everything comes across on this little
Flying fox?
sort of thing. All good stuff when you're going up and down like this in the ocean. And we learned all how to do all of that stuff, and we also learned how to clean the bilges with our toothbrush if we did anything wrong. Again, because we were off to a pilot's course and not there to be seaman officers, it was all sort of cobbled together. To basically, we had to fill in time, and they sort of, cobbled it all together and gave us something to do. But there was a lot of laying around in the sun, which was fabulous. The ship bit was pretty interesting and fun, mostly fun.
Were you just champing at the bit to just go ahead and learn to fly?
Oh yeah, well that's what I was there for, And all this is just this is all just how long can you hold your breath? You just wanted to get on with it. But no, hurry up and wait. Stand in line, hurry up and wait. Typical military thing, But eventually we got to Point Cook and started.
Can you give us a bit of a journey of your training as a pilot?
Well, the flight training started at Point Cook, and we flew Wingeals, and they are an Australian-designed single radial engined fixed wing, and they're built like bricks pretty much, which is good because they get some pretty harsh treatment. But a good, honest airplane, and I did 125 hours or so, which is the normal for the course. And although I didn't know much about what I was doing, I was enjoying it. I really liked to be flying. And like I said before, I don't know that I was particularly good at it to start with, but I enjoyed it.
Andy, can you talk us through, I guess, some of those early hours, or just how they actually physically trained and taught you to fly?
Well, you do all the flight school, ground school,
Yeah.
and all of it's just sort of geeing you up, I think. But when you get in, and you've learned all your checks, and you've done all your pre-startup checks, and you've got all the way to now it's time to go, and he says, "Oh, you're going to start it," and you look at him, and it's just, once that noise starts, that's a very tricky time. That's when you're committed. You hit the noise, and some of these aircraft start up with a hell of a noise. And then that's when it can get really scary, because now there's all this amazing stuff going on. And in some aircraft, when you hit the go button, you start a sequence that takes a little while to work its way through, and you're sitting there, and you've hit the tip, and now you're a passenger waiting for it all to happen, and then when it's sort of all got going and settled down, you do your after start checks, and now here's the other, gut-wrenching thing. You've actually got to go and make it move, take the brakes off, and taxi. Oh. And so you go through all of these stages, and with familiarisation, the stages get less of a problem. I still have a problem with start, well, right up until I retired, Until the noise starts, you can undo your harness, open the door and step out. Once that noise starts, oh, now you're committed. You've got to do something. and so, yeah, you just go through, and that's one of the reasons why they train you with all these what they call vital actions, and that's why they have all these checklists, and you just go through the checklists, and if you do it the same every single time, and if all your vital actions, like height, harness, equipment, locality, lookout, is the checklist for pre-aerobatic checklist. Now that I learned that back in 1967, and it's still, all these things stay with you forever and ever, like your service number. These things are imprinted on your brain, and that's. You might start out being a really mediocre sort of pilot, but if you work on all these basics, eventually you get it, and you can add your own touches to it, and eventually you can get really good at it. And it's all this huge learning curve, from sitting there, dumbass kid from Tassie, to being a pilot. And it's, it's something that you've got to keep working on.
So with these first planes, the
Wingeals.
how many checklists might you have?
Well, you've got a pre-start,
yeah.
You've got an after-start, you've got a taxi checklist, then you get out to the runway, you've got a pre-takeoff checklist, and then you take off. There's an after-takeoff checklist, there's checks climbing out, there's checks before you do any aerobatics, there's checks, every single stage of the journey's got a check, especially when you're in ab initio flight training. Joining the circuit checklist, downwind checklist, base leg checklist, finals checklist. There's always something that you've got to be doing here to make sure that when you get there, you're ready for it. And they teach you, like in those days, we learned in these Wingeals, and they're lumbering along, and it takes you a little while to even sort of get ahead of that. But the whole concept is to be ahead of the ball. You've got to be ahead of the game all the time, so that by the time you get there, you're prepared for what's going to happen. It's no use getting to a runway and not having the wheels down. So you've got to check that the wheels are actually down and green, Vampires, down the centre of the runway, brake, speed below 175, speed brakes in, undercarriage down, 3 greens, check brakes. Everything's working. Base. It just all happens. And a lot of aircraft have command and response, and it's all part of cockpit drills, but when you're there by yourself, it all just reels off in your head. And like the operations manual can be a book this big and that thick, and you know every single word in it. You have to, because that's what keeps you alive. All of that stuff is what's keeping you alive. And with a military aircraft, flying the aircraft is only this much of the job. That's it. All the aircraft is a tool to carry all of these people over to that point there, or all of these munitions, and pour it all onto that poor bastard down there. The aircraft is just a secondary thing. You're using it to do something. So all of this flying business has to be automatic. You have to have this situational awareness so that you know what the aircraft is doing, whilst you're computing in your head the job itself. And of course every job can be different, but flying the aircraft is the same. And so you have to have all of that going on and all happening automatically, so you can think about your job, which is what you're there for in the first place.
So, can you give us a bit of a... I'm not actually that familiar with the winged eels. Can you give us a bit of a picture on what they look like, besides a brick?
Well, they're fixed undercarriage, radial engine. Do you know what a radial engine is?
Single prop. Right.
Single propeller, but a radial engine, for instance, your car engine is in line, right? If you've got like a little car, and then you get slightly bigger cars and they have Vs, a V6. You're familiar with V6 and V8 and all that sort of stuff, right? Well, that's just how the pistons are arranged on each side of the crankshaft. Well, in a radial engine, you've got the pistons are all lined up all the way around the outside, and you can have single row radials and twins and threes, great big engines that have got all these pistons all the way around the outside, and all those are connected to this crank that's, in the case of an aircraft, got a propeller on the front of it. And this propeller will have 2 blades, or 3 or 4 or 5 or more. The Windgill had a single row radial engine, 2-bladed prop, constant speed unit, fixed undercarriage, low wing, side-by-side seating, canopy pulled back like that. You got out, climbed onto the wing and got out. Tail dragger, as against like, you understand tail dragger?
No.
The tail, it has a tail wheel instead of a tricycle undercarriage, which has a nose wheel. Are you
I'm getting a picture.
getting
yes.
a picture?
Yes. And how about the cockpit itself? I mean, obviously.
Side by side.
Yeah.
You have your pedals, the rudder pedals that have got brakes, differential braking on the pedals, i.e. if you press down on the right pedal, the right brake works, and the left for the left brake, and you can steer the tail wheel. The tail wheel will actually lock or unlock, and for taxiing you have it unlocked, but for takeoff and landing you have it locked, because there's nothing worse than landing with an unlocked tail wheel, because that can spin your aircraft around, and that's called a ground loop, and that's not a good idea. The faster your ground loop, the more you rip bits off your aircraft. The cockpit, all the instruments are, on an instrument panel. You have your joystick, or whatever you want to call it, in the middle between your legs, and you have your throttle and mixture lever in a quadrant under your left hand. Different aircraft have different cockpit setups. The British cockpits of my era were absolutely chaotic. The Wessex, for instance, had things everywhere with no particular rhyme nor reason. Every time they'd put something in it, retrofit something, they'd put the switch for it over there, and the lever for it over here, and the indicator's somewhere else, and they do things like doll's eyes. They have little things that sort of flop around like doll's eyes to tell you whether it's on or off, you know, instead of having like a light that says on. The American cockpits tended to be better organised, and they have warning panels, you know, and it's a whole panel, a whole bunch of lights all together, and all the gauges are all in a row, and if you've got multiple engines, you've got multiple gauges, but they're all paired up and such like. Much easier to use. Just they were more technologically advanced with cockpits. Nowadays you use, most of it's called NATO standard, so cockpits tend to be standardised, so you can get out of one aircraft into the next aircraft, and everything's, the handle on the stick has got all these different knobs and things in the same places, you know, and you have a NATO standard stick. I'm talking about helicopters now. Once I got out of fixed wing vampires, you know, and there's another thing, a vampire. Now, Frank Whittle was the inventor of a gas turbine engine, and the Vampire had his Mark II version, I think. So we're talking about an aircraft that was designed at the latter stages of the Second World War. The first ever gas turbine engine in a fixed wing. And I flew it. Oh Lord. Yeah, it was balsa wood and canvas at the front. You know, they had metal bits in it, but lots of balsa wood framework and canvas and...
Literally balsa wood.
Hey, watch my lips.
Oh my God.
Wood, canvas, stuff. Yes. First ever jet engine. Jet, yeah. It was all, you know, interesting stuff. I was the last course on vampires. Lucky, eh? The Navy had its own version called a Venom. Slightly bigger. Slightly bigger. Had a Rolls-Royce Goblin instead of a Rolls-Royce Neen or... I can't remember all that stuff now. Yeah.
But essentially the same plane?
Essentially the same plane.
Yeah.
Side-by-side cockpit. Twin booms, going back to a sort of connected horizontal elevator sort of thing with horizontal tailplane with the elevators on it, and two little stubby vertical fins with a little rudder thingy on the back. Ancient stuff.
With the windshields, were they dual controlled, or was it?
Yes.
It was all okay.
Yeah.
So you weren't
all
on
of
your
these
own.
training, all these training aircraft are all dual control. And the biggest shock of your life is when you roll to a stop at the end of the landing, and the bloody instructor, undoes his seat harness and stands up and turns around, locks it all up, and opens the canopy. You open the canopy and he stop here, and he goes, "See you later. I'm walking back." And that's it. You're going to fly solo now, and you've got to remember what you got to tell the tower and how to taxi back to the other end, and you got to remember how to do all of that stuff, because now he's no longer there. It's all up to you. And if you kill yourself, it's your own fault. And that's a very traumatic moment. You talk about fear and trepidation. But it's like also it's the most exhilarating moment when I'm flying. Just me, all by myself in this aircraft. I'm the master in command of this lot. And all right, he's just told me to do one circuit and then come back. But for this one circuit, I'm the man. And the exhilaration, you know, and you come back and you get this, you know, like this smile on your face and, oh, you went solo? Yeah. Far out. And there's always a bit of the blokes, there's always a, you know, the gifted ones go solo before the plodders, you know. I'm a plodder. So, you know, I was somewhere down the back there, but it didn't make any difference to me because I'm there, I'm doing it, and I just couldn't believe it, you know, I'm doing it. And then you just build on that. Each day you go out and you do, in the morning you might do a dual trip whilst he's showing you all of this sort of stuff. And then in the afternoon you'll be scheduled to go out and do it all by yourself. And that's what you do. No goofing off. Oh, not that they can catch you. But the worst thing is, of course, you know, like the air's full of windshields, you know, like there's heaps of them. And so you can't get out of sight of all of these because there's always going to be instructors looking. But you have, you know, it's fun. Once you're doing it yourself, and then you progress through all the different lessons that you have to do to learn, and not like in civvies where, you know, like after 20 hours, that's it, here's your license, see you later. You know, the military are a bit more careful about their training, and they just, in fact, the military is just all about, that's all you ever do, training, you know. And so you're just honing the skills all the time. And so even with 125 hours, which in Civvy Street would give you a commercial licence to go out and hire yourself out to any fool that wanted to pay you, you don't even get your wings. You know, now you've got to go to AFTS, Advanced Flight Training School, Pierce Air Force Base, jet planes. Yahoo buckaroo. Even those old planes, you know, they still do Mach 0.8, you know, and it's really fun to be going fast. It's really fun to go off the end of the runway and hold it down till you get to VNE, which is the fastest speed you can go without on the books, and then you just get two hands and you pull it vertical, and you can with a Vampire you could still, from VNE at ground level, you could pull it vertical and roll out at something a little bit over 20,000 feet. So you go vertical for just go up like a homesick angel. And the feeling of, you know, you pull it up and you know vertical because the horizon's like that and the wing's like that, and you're going straight up, and you're going up on full power plus all the inertia you've built up. And when you look like you're going to stop flying, you roll it out into wings level and you go, check it out.
That's
and
amazing.
it's just, you know, like, it's all serious business, but in amongst all this serious business, there's so much exhilaration. Like, you know, it's one thing to go, you know, 125 knots or whatever it was, you know, across the paddocks of Western Victoria in your windshield. It's another to whack your Vampire down into the wheat fields of Western Australia and cut a swathe through the wheat because you're doing it all at 10 feet, you know, because for miles and miles and miles there's not even a damn tree. You got to be careful of the power lines though. You know, like flying past a farmer on his tractor, eh? And of course you're going so fast they can't hear you. You're not going above these, you're not going supersonic, so they do get to hear you like just a little bit before you get there. But like they're sitting on a tractor going along like this, the next thing you fly right past their wheels, looking straight out at them. It's great fun. These are the things that fire you up, and you just, it's exhilarating to do all this stuff, and part of your training is all this 2v1 and stuff like that, where you have one guy's the bad guy and you got two guys chasing you, and 1v1s where you just, and all you're doing is doing all of this fighter stuff where he's got to get behind you and technically shoot you down, and you got to stop him and hopefully shoot him down. And it's a real lot of hack flick zoom.
What do you mean by hack flick zoom?
Well, that's what it is. It's like not sitting there trimmed out straight and level. It's zooming around and all those manoeuvres you learn. High-speed scissors and low-speed scissors comes to mind, and all that pulling maximum G in around turns, because if you're in the same aircraft and you're pulling maximum G, he can't pull lead on you because he's just got to follow you around. But there's all sorts of manoeuvres you play around with, and it's all teaching you to fly to the limits. First off, your limits, because your limits are so mediocre anyway, and then eventually, if you get really good, you can fly to the aircraft's limits. And then later on in life, when I was into helicopters and things like that, you can fly way past the aircraft's limits. Some of these aircraft are very limited in what they're technically allowed to do. But if you're good, you can go way out past that limit without breaking it up or exceeding any of its structural limits. But that's only comes much later on, after well and truly when you've learnt your trade and you're good at what you do and you know what you can do. But you're always pushing the limit. They'd say it's really bad to be doing that, but I found I was always pushing the limits, because the jobs I did, later on, for instance, doing high altitude heavy lift, and where they're asking you to pull off the side of a mountain some underslung load that is in fact too heavy to pull off the side of the mountain, but there are techniques to get it off, and there's techniques to make grossly overloaded helicopters actually fly without busting the helicopter, and you learn how to do it.
I'll have to ask you about some of those in a little while. But I'm curious with the Vampires were just a training plane at that stage.
Yes.
So did you have a sense of where you were going?
Yes.
And where was that? With starting off on the Winged Eels and then going to Vampires.
Well, by the time I got to Pierce, I had a fairly good sense of where they thought I was going, and I wasn't going to be a jet pilot, because all the cream all go to jets, and then the not so cream and so on until they all go to fixed wing doing this and that. The Air Force guys, of course, have got a huge, much larger range than the Navy. But the Navy have still got, fixed wing piston, fixed wing, they have stuff that they do. They got, in my day they had the A4 Skyhawks and S2E trackers. There was some DC-3s around that the Navy flew. I don't know if they had HS-748s. The Air Force certainly did, and I can't remember if the Navy did or not. But other than that, they had helicopters. And by the time I got to Pierce, or whilst I was in Pierce, it became, you know, what was happening in the world, plus what was happening in my world, seemed to indicate that first off, they wanted more helicopter pilots, and secondly, it seemed inevitable, given my grades, that I wasn't going to be one of their best qualifiers, graduates, let's say. So it looked like I was going to go to helicopters, and as far as I was concerned, that was fine by me. And in retrospect, it was fine by me, because once you've flown a helicopter, fixed wing are pretty bloody ordinary. Yeah. Wow. Helicopters are just another, and that's really weird, because the military hierarchy, especially in the Navy, they would take blokes, and if they couldn't fly jets and then they'd downgrade them to like fixed wing other things, and then if they failed that, they'd eventually end up in helicopters. And of course, all the down on the helicopter squadrons, you know, people would just sit around scratching their heads, saying, you know, like, if you they had it asked backwards. You just have to be better to fly a helicopter. End of story. You've got to be better. You've got to be a better pilot. You've got to have a better situational everything, you know. And there'll be fighter pilots out there that'll disagree with me, but they don't know.
This is going to be an obvious question for someone who was a helicopter pilot, but why do you have to be a better pilot? I mean, I can imagine all sorts of answers, but it'd be good to hear it from you.
Well, one of the first things that one of my first instructors on Windshield said, that if I got into trouble, let it go, because it can fly better than you can. Fixed wings, trimmed out, want to fly. You've actually got to bugger it up to stop it flying. They want to fly. The design, all of that stuff, everything that's designed into them is to make them fly. You know, if you're sitting on the end of the runway and you apply power, and you must remember, there's been several occasions. There was one classic one in Sydney some years ago now, where somebody in their fixed wing has stepped out to hand start without putting the handbrake on, and the damn aircraft has started all right, revved up and took off all by itself. And there was a classic in Sydney that it flew for hours, all by itself without a pilot at all. Now let me tell you, my friend, you flash up a helicopter, have it flying along in mid-air, and have the pilot step out and see how long it's going to fly. The fact is, and there's all kinds of stories and there's all kinds of little sayings, you know, helicopters are just a collection of nuts and bolts all flying along in close formation. You know, the thing is, a helicopter doesn't want to fly, and you have to be there all the time to make it fly. It's only in later years that helicopters have got autopilots. And, you know, autopilot on a fixed wing's easy. On a helicopter, they needed a whole lot more technology. And it's only since, like, computers have happened that you can make you can put enough information in an autopilot to make it fly a helicopter. And that therein is the difference. One wants to fly, one doesn't. One, will fly by itself, even a monkey can do it. The other one, you've got to have some serious ability. And even a lot of people with some very serious ability have come gutses over some very simple things, but helicopters are different to fixed wing, and the pilots are usually very different sort of people as well. And in those days, up until I think we were the first course that graduated and got our wings and still hadn't made acting sub-lieutenant, because the Navy in their wisdom decided they were going to slow up all promotions, and so we were actually still midshipmen, still not commissioned officers, but in the true sense, qualified pilots, and you had to go the full 2 years before you got your acting sub-lieutenant stripe, and there's another year before you make sub-lieutenant, and another 6 years to make lieutenant. So it just all takes a hell of a long time, which of course was a bit contrary to what we found with the other military that we went to work with. And like there's guys who've just arrived and just got there, and they're sort of changing their rank regularly, quickly, not to mention how much they get paid. But we just sort of go, oh well, that's what they do and this is what we do. But it made it really difficult. For instance, there was the situation where the Navy had promised all their returning people that they'd get preferential postings, as by way of thanks for a good job, blokes. But it turns out there's no such thing for a sub-lieutenant. I wanted to become an instructor, or go to the Moresby flight or do something other than sort of hang around in Nowra and fly Wessex. I didn't want to fly Wessex, but they were being phased out anyway. So all the things I put in for I wasn't allowed to do. But other pilots that came back who were ahead of me got their preferential postings. So that was a bit of a bone of contention. The other major bone of contention, of course, was that a lot of these jobs, it was their policy in the Navy not to give these jobs to pilots that hadn't done a frontline tour of duty. And I hadn't done a frontline tour of duty because Vietnam wasn't considered a frontline tour of duty.
Without getting into the government policies on that and all that kind of stuff, why in layman's terms wasn't it considered a frontline duty? You couldn't get more frontline.
Good question. There's a couple of things, and it's just the internal Navy politics, I'm sure. But for instance, we went as the name of the group was the Royal Australian Naval Helicopter Flight Vietnam, HFVN. There was 4 of them, and I was on HFV 3. We were all seconded for duty in Vietnam from 723 Squadron. All squadrons starting with a 7 are second line squadrons. They're not frontline squadrons. Normally you'd do your helicopter training on 723, and then you went to 725 Squadron, which was a second line Wessex Squadron, and then you'd get posted to the frontline Wessex Squadron, and eventually you'd get embark on board HMAS Melbourne and go out and do all that stuff that they do at sea with the Melbourne and its fleet of ships. But I never did any of that. So as far as the Navy was concerned, and in Navy terms, I'd never been to any frontline squadron. I'd just been seconded off a second line squadron, and now I'm back and I'm behind the 8 ball of what they really want me to do in the Navy. I haven't been doing. And they're not going to let me go and fly a Jet Ranger off the back of Moresby, or teach young blokes to fly helicopters in, I don't know what they were training in then, Jet Rangers over at Canberra. You know, not allowed to do that until you've flown a Wessex off the Melbourne. It's vitally important. But that's the long-winded answer. You haven't done a frontline tour of duty, that's it, mate. Ah, rightio. And you're a sub-lieutenant. Ah, so you just hurry up and wait. And I wasn't in any mind to hurry up and wait anymore. Too much shit in the brain back from Vietnam, too much anger, too much aggravation, too much stuff happening. And I had a very good friend who would basically run interference for me with some of the other more senior officers. This guy just took me under his wing. It was just, it happens. This guy, we became friends. He was more senior than I was. He knew his way around the business, and he was always looking out for me. And he was just one of the nicest guys you could ever imagine. And when he came back from Vietnam, he was only back a short while, and he died. Alcohol poisoning at a party, and that was the end of it for me. I just wasn't very happy with what was happening to me and their attitude, and I felt that there was a certain amount of discrimination. I was being discriminated against. I wasn't allowed to do what I wanted to do. I wasn't allowed to. I really liked to fly, and so I'd go off to other squadrons and fly, and then they wouldn't let me do that because they said, you're not allowed to do that. You've got to go to this squadron. And I said, well, I'm not being posted. So they posted me, and then I didn't fly. And I was sort of flying 1 or 2 hours a month, and you can't even maintain currency on 1 or 2 hours a month when you're doing a conversion. And like a Wessex conversion should take a month, 2 months. But I has ostensibly been trying to do it for a year when I got out, and I still hadn't finished the conversion. It's mad. You can't. That's just another mad thing, and you think, I can't be bothered with this. So I went and got a job where I was flying 100 hours a month for somebody else in civvies, and getting paid for it, and learning more, and speaking foreign languages, and travelling again, and getting away from Australia. They were mad. I didn't want any part of it. It took me a while to settle down into civilians, but I never did. So I swapped jobs a lot.
That brings me to talking about your direct posting after you'd graduated and got your wings.
Yeah,
Now, this
723 Squadron.
That was still obviously before Vietnam.
Yes.
What did you have to do directly between that and going overseas to Vietnam?
Oh well, my first posting was to 723 Squadron, which is the if you wish, an ab initio helicopter flight training, where you go to learn how to fly a helicopter. Because up until that minute, never touched a helicopter. So, although I had my wings, now I had to transition onto helicopters, which is like sort of starting all over again.
In that time, though, just when you had finished doing the helicopter training, were you assigned to a ship?
No.
That's
No,
just
after.
all the training, and then
I was assigned to HFV3, and then we did the workup, the pre-embarkation workup. Again, that's a thing that the Navy do with every squadron. You know, oh, we're going to join the fleet. We're going to, so they get all their helicopters together and they go out and, you know, start doing the exercises so that they embark, and then everybody's hot. And that's all you do. You go around in the fleet and you take all your helicopters off and you do the plane guard, you do all the jobs associated with that squadron embarked. So I got my piece of paper to say that I was being seconded. No, I was being posted to HFV3, and so that meant a lot of work up with the Army. So we did Army exercises. We flew out and joined the Army on exercise, and we carried troops, and we did Army training. We went to Canungra and became green-clad jungle killers, trained to the peak of proficiency in the arts of rape, deception and tactical river crossings. And you had to say that very quickly. I used to be able to say it very quickly.
you've lapsed because I picked everything up.
Yeah. And so you snuck through the jungle and you did all that jungle warfare training stuff. And you went to Woodside in Western Australia, which is another army base, and they did code of conduct and that sort of stuff over there. I don't know whether they still do it.
So you went to Canungra and did the whole...
Yeah, we had, because that's part of our workup. We're going to join the army, got to look like army. Got to, you know, you've got to start thinking army, thinking what they do. If we're going to be army, we got to understand what they're doing. You know, troops and tracks and army stuff.
Did you get on better with the army blokes than the navy blokes? Do you think you fitted in more with the army mentality rather than the navy mentality?
I don't think that no. The army and the navy, when I was there, always had a really close relationship. Army navy was always pretty close. We never had any bother. We always enjoyed. It was good. Going to army stuff was always good. I mean, I did the Air Force. What do they call it? Escape and evasion course. I got into trouble on that too. But the Air Force, of course, is the odd man out in all of this. Always has been.
So the escape and
Evasion.
evasion.
E&E.
E&E.
Yeah.
Did you obviously did that before you went to Vietnam?
Yep.
And that was after Canungra.
I can't remember the chronology there.
But it was all part
of that.
Getting you ready.
Getting ready. How to live on for a week on a 24-hour ration pack, and go from A to B in the jungle and not get caught.
Did any of this you find more interesting than, for for instance, did you prefer that course that you did, the escape course?
To naval gunnery?
Yeah.
Funny you should say that. I got more out of the Claymore course than I did out of naval gunnery. I got more out of everything. Probably because I then went to the United States Army, and although I didn't have to E&E, although there were occasions when it was looking pretty dicey, when you interesting question. Yeah, because the fact of the matter was that once I started doing all that army stuff, and then once I went over and did my time in the United States Army, the fact is I was a whole lot more oriented towards that than I was to Navy, and that was probably part of the reason why I didn't fit back into the Navy too well. Now, that's all very well for a 21-year-old to say. I was 21 years old, right? But if the Navy had had any common sense at all, they would have taken these blokes and given them time to get back. Easy to say now, because part of the courses that you can, the courses that you do is with the Vietnam Veterans Counselling Service is about coming back. And if ever there was a group of individuals that needed it, it was the Navy guys that came back from Vietnam. There's a very high percentage of them that aren't well people. And they come back from situations that the Navy in general had absolutely no knowledge of whatsoever. And these blokes needed to be brought back to the Navy. But the Navy are notoriously bad for the way they manage their men. Their manpower management's still abysmal. I was just reading something about it just recently. They prefer to talk about loose cannons and how to get rid of them easy without too much embarrassment than, you know, how to look after them and preserve their knowledge.
That's what I was going to ask you. There was two questions. One was about going to America. Now, did you go to America before you went to Vietnam?
No.
It was after, wasn't it? It was still part of your service.
I never went to America until a few years ago.
But you were supposed to go to America, is that right?
No.
Or did they have training?
The Navy used to train its pilots in America before my group. They had a whole, for years, Navy pilots went to Pensacola in Florida.
But you didn't go because it wasn't near you.
No. By the time I got there, they changed that. Oh, I don't see a problem with that. It's a different system, that's all.
You went to Perth.
I went to Perth. Flew Vampires.
I'm curious to know what you personally thought of getting your posting to Vietnam, considering you'd kind of, like we'd established this morning, that you were sort of interested in a career in the Navy, but now you're being posted to a war zone, and what you thought of that personally at the time.
Well, I think you'll find that everybody in the military feels the same about that generally. The fact is that you spend the whole time you're in the military, in a peacetime military, you spend it practicing. you practice and practice till you just think this is mad, and and I'm sick of it, and why can't we go somewhere and do something? And here's a situation where part of our military was going somewhere and doing something. The whole of the army was involved. Bits of the Air Force were involved. The Navy was involved with going somewhere and doing something because they had the gun pickets offshore. And then they had these curious little bunches of people, like the clearance divers on the hill at Bung Tau, and the Navy teams associated with the US Army. And the US Army had made this group, this company. They'd formed a company, and the 135th Assault Helicopter Company, and they called it the EMUs. EMU being Experimental Military Unit. And so, for the most part, all you're doing is doing what you're being trained for. Actually using the skills that you've learned. You're 20 years old. You're absolutely invincible. What better way to figure out how good you are than to put it to the test? The reality can be quite different. But when you're sitting down there in your training role, doing this and doing that, you're thinking, I just wish we were finished with this training bullshit and get on with the real thing. And so that's it. You get posted, you jump on the big bird, and you step off in Saigon. It's a bit of a jolt for the system. So as far as how I felt about it, yahoo, bring it on. 20. Can you remember that far? You didn't, like I didn't have any, you haven't developed really strong political beliefs, philosophical, I don't know about other people, I was just this piece of clay that was still being moulded, and I just said, bring it on, I'm ready.
So what were your first impressions of Saigon when you got there then?
Huh.
A few hours later.
I was bloody amazed. Yeah. Going into Tonsanut, all those military aircraft, and everywhere you look there's military, and then you get into this city of teeming millions. And again, there's military everywhere you look. And picked up and carried by helicopter to Bearcat, which was this huge base, mostly Thais. That was the headquarters of the Thai push. But American aviation companies were there. And landed out in the jungle, behind this red dirt berm, and everybody's military, and everybody's got, just suddenly you're in this big military camp, and it's just like you're just walking around with your eyes wide open, and people are telling you stuff, yeah, you don't know shit, but you just, okay, and people get hold, and it's just part of the military system, that looks after 20, 19-year-old dickheads, they just take them and just keep processing down the line, and you just come out the other end and you go, what do I do now? Well, there's 25 people that'll tell you, and and you go here and you go there, and you know, and tomorrow morning you get up and there's your name on the board, and you just go down there and find that aircraft, and the captain, and you know, he says, get in there, sit down, shut up. And you know, your first flight when you're going off, and the first everything, you know, you go, oh, what's going on, you know. But after the first few times, it's like the whole flight training thing, you know. After you've done it a few times, you go, oh, I know what's going on. I'm cool, you know. And then, you know, when there's guns and gunships and people shooting and yelling and yahooing and all that stuff's going on, you know, again, the first time you go, bloody hell, what's this? And you get a bit, what's going on here? But after a while, the whole thing sort of just becomes normal. And that's the problem. Therein lies the problem. The death and destruction and body bags and blood and guts and trips here and there and stuff going on and the bullshit and everything is normal. And there's nobody in charge. I don't care what you say, there's nobody in charge. You know? Are you telling me that President Key or whatever his name, was he in charge? Oh, I don't think so. You know? He wasn't allowed to say anything. Some general had come down and tromp on his ass. You know? Do you think the Australians down in Tweed province were in charge of anything? Yeah, they might have been in charge of their own little anthill about that big. You know, but even then, if anything big happened, you know, they got told what to do. Who's in charge of this, you know? And then when you get out and about, when you get a little bit off the edge of their radars, nobody's in charge. So you just go about whatever you're supposed to do. And the rest of the time you're just sort of flying through this command vacuum where you as the pilot in command, you're in command.
And this is the feeling you have at the time when you're there?
Yeah. It's amazing. You know, it's amazing. You do your job, you go, you know, like, and everybody knows that the Australian forces aren't allowed within, you know, 7 miles during the night and 3 miles during the day or whatever of the Cambodian line, border, you know. So when some bloke gets on and he's in civilians, he jumps on your aircraft and says, right, there, points to a point on the map. It's in the suburbs of bloody Phnom Penh. You go, yeah, no worries. We've got to refuel on the way though. So you refuel at Mokwa and just keep on going north. You know? They go, what's going on here? We're not supposed to be here. Oh, no, we're not here. That's why I'm in civilians. Oh, good. What about us? Sin loy, motherfucker. That's where that expression comes from. Stiff shit. Nobody cares about you.
So that's what Sinlai means.
Sinloi.
Sinlai.
Yeah, so you just, and you know, but you go, wait a minute, you know, my government, you know, your government? Yeah, right. Just keep flying, you know, don't be telling me about your government. Not that I, you know, like, what am I going to do? Oh, no, I'm not going to fly you? Oh, yeah, right. You know? And it's just, that's just part of it. You know, blokes get on and say, oh, we're going to go out and kill some people. Oh, yeah, how are we going to do that? Watch this. And you do. And you go out and find them and you just off them. You know, and because there's all these free fire zones, which means at any time, 24/7, you can go down there. If there's anybody there, they're bad guys. That's why they're called free fire zones. Everywhere else, you've got to ring them up and you've got to say, oh, I got a bad guy over here. And they go, oh, what's he look like? Oh, he's in black pyjamas, got a conical hat. That's a bad guy, hit him. Is he running? No, he's not running. Mark him. You got all this smoke, right? Smoke. You'd mark him. Roger, I see your white smoke. He's running. There's no white smoke. That's CS. Of course he's bloody running gas. Oh yeah, who's in charge of this? Don't know. Not me. Anarchist's heaven. That's what I said before. Nobody's in charge. It's horse shit. It's a war on. You know, and all this shit's happening right 20 years old. Eyes this friggin' big. You go, I can't believe this stuff. And you're part of it. And you're part of it whether you want to be or not. And things are happening, you know, and they're happening whether you want them to happen or not. And a lot of them are happening with the full command structure right there in front of you. Where you are just sitting there going, yes, sir. He goes, go in there, rightio. I go like that because the CNC is always sitting right up the top. Command and control ship. Command and control ship's got the boss in it. And sitting behind the boss with a great big console full of radios is the, in our case, because we're working 4-core, which was already Vietnamised, has got the Vietnamese boss and his senior advisor and their flunkies. And you've got to have a flunky. The higher up the chain, the more flunkies you've got, see. Anyway, yeah, so, you know, he goes, oh, that's what, go, do that. Yes, sir, and you just do it. You know, and if it's nasty, you just try and get it over and done with as quickly as possible. Hot LZs. You know, you'd often go into places where it was heavily contested. That's a sort of euphemistic way of saying that there's heaps of bad guys there and they're really angry. Yeah, and so they get down in their bunkers and they start shooting up and you're shooting down, and you know, and the more of them there are, you try and get as more of your guys. And I went out at times, like this one particular time up near the wagon wheel. The last trip, we're on our way home, and they've rung up and said, oh, on your way home we want to drop off a night ambush group, you know, and this is, you fly them in, you drop them off, and they all climb into sort of ambush positions and they sit and watch a track, not a track. I got into trouble with track because I said, there's all these tracks up here, and of course in army language, tracks is mechanised, you know, track, and of course they need to shit themselves down in Venlong. What I meant was all these little paths. Yeah, so these guys, you put them off and they'd sit on a path somewhere and hoping, you know, one or two bad guys would wander by. Well, we flew over the tree line and there's a whole bloody division of NVA there. And they're all sitting out and there's easels and blokes with pointy sticks and, you know, there's battalions of them all lined up. They're all having their evening get-together. And we got like 2 or 3 ships with 15 blokes on board and a light fire team just to keep us company. And suddenly we're in the middle of the biggest firefight you ever saw in your life. And we finished up the next morning at like going home at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and we'd put in like 2 or 3 battalions of troops, and they'd had 50 aircraft in the area stacked up from gunships right down the bottom through A1E Sky Raiders, Snoopies, F100s, F4s. They just stack all this stuff up and just let them at it. Just clear all guys out and say, your turn. And you know, it got into this huge fight. And there's dead helicopters laying all over the place and, you know, that sort of stuff. So these things just happened sometimes, and sometimes they were planned. But it didn't seem like anybody was in charge. You know, you might be in charge of this little bit here, but over there. And when it came to the whole country, of course, during the day, was on our side. and during the night was on their side.
Yeah, I hear that a lot.
My hooch mate used to come in, she'd have bruises all over her shoulders. You've been out carrying rockets all night? Oh no, she used to hate it when I said that. You've been carrying rockets. So I don't care what you do at night time. Just make sure them shoes are clean. Clean out my hooch. Oh, you're number 10. What am I going to say? You're not allowed to carry rockets at night for the NVA? Tell them Andy said. Oh yeah, that'll be right. G'day. Well, Andy said I'm not allowed to carry rockets tonight. Yeah, right, yeah. What bullshit.
Was there a sense for you of personal danger?
Well, that's, yeah.
In terms of like living day to day with anybody who could be enemy. I mean, is that part of the craziness of the
Yeah. I got in a cab in Saigon and I'm going somewhere, and then I know my way around, you know. We're not going where I want to go. And next thing, there's all these bloody cowboys. Cowboys, they used to wear like sort of cowboy hats, but they all rode around on little bikes, you know, 80cc step-throughs. And they used to go around in groups, and a lot of them were, if not Viet Cong, they were like gangs, you know. And they used to run amok, and my whole cab was surrounded by like 20 of these guys. And they're trying to get the cab to stop. And he'd gone off a main road, and we're on a little road. Like, and suddenly they're all armed. They're all waving their guns around, and you know, there's streets like full of people. And it's only, like I thought, any time now, you know, like the gun's going to come through a window and that's it. So I thought, oh, the best way out of this is to be first. So I got mine out first. And what are you going to do? Point it out the window? I don't think so. I shoved it in the cab driver's ear. You should have seen us, we bloody flew. But, you know, these things happen. And you know, like we get helicopters shot down right going over the berm, going onto the strip, you know, from some kid that's sitting just outside. You know, you'd climb up on top of your helicopter in the morning to do your pre-flight, and some guy's whacking you from the berm. And half the time from your own berm. Because by the time we moved to Dong Tam, the whole of the perimeter's been guarded by Vietnamese. Jesus, just after we left, the bad guys run over the berm and run through the whole company area. Just after I was left, the bloody mortar came down through my bloody roof, went straight through the middle of my floor without going off. Lucky, eh? I was home by then. I mean, it didn't go off, so... But still, you know, you just don't need that kind of aggravation, do you?
Not really.
But that's just like things like that, you know. You never know what's going to happen, and you don't know where it's going to come from. And yeah, it's a bit of a worry.
And what was your first taste of that when you first arrived, I guess, in Bearcat? And I guess, you know, whatever activities you were doing first off.
Well, I can't... The first taste of...
The chaos, I guess.
Well, that's it. I mean, you get off the Qantas flight and the first thing you see is chaos. And it's going on, you know, the whole time whilst you're there. And there just doesn't seem to be any order to anything. And you can really use it to your advantage. I was a company scrounge. And it gave me something to do on my days off. You know, every now and then you get a day off, and sometimes I'd like to take 2 days off. And I'd take I used to borrow a chopper and just fly around, you know, and go and see people. Because after a while I got to know all kinds of people. And I got to know senior NCOs in charge of warehouses that had, you know, $10 million worth of stuff in there. any kind of stuff you want. Toilet systems to helicopters. And there was no inventory. So if you wanted a helicopter, you could have a helicopter. Here's a helicopter. What am I going to do with that? Well, what about a Jeep? Yeah, I could use a Jeep. Well, there's a Jeep. I just want this. And sometimes he wanted it for himself, and sometimes he wanted to swap on with somebody else because somebody else has got something that he wants. But that went on all the time. And there's no inventory. Anywhere where a cab company pilot can use 4 helicopters in one day and just leave them lying around the bush, who cares about stuff? And that's what amazed me. I picked up this air cav, and he was a Loach driver, LOH6, and it was his 4th crash that day. I couldn't believe it. I mean, you'd be a gibbering wreck, I thought, but he was, he's mad. He's probably still mad, if he's still alive. But, but that sort of environment, you sort of get more and more of it, and yeah, I used to take we had this retrieval truck, which great big, bloody prime mover with an 80-foot flatbed, low loader. And I'd load it up with stuff and drive back to the company. Because the first thing the boys did when they got to Bearcat, they said, we can't, the boss was aghast that you've got to sit in a 6-holer. You got
to sit in a what, sorry?
6-holer. Shitter. And take a dump with lower ranks. I mean, that is just not on, eh? That's pretty crude, isn't it? So first thing we had to do was build heads and showers. And we did. Everywhere we went, we'd get together the stuff. We'd go off and they'd go, you, go and get, we want 6 toilets and 5 urinals and, all the showers, all the plumbing, a couple of tons of bags of cement. We need a truckload of this and we need some of that and we need all the lumber and all the roofing on. You'd go, yeah, okay. Give me a list. They'd give me a list and I'd go up to the boss and I'd say, give me all the bloody captured SKSs and anything we can afford. And I'd take it all with me. But the best thing to swap was a pallet of VB because they drink all their slops. Like they drink Schlitz, PBR, Pabst Blue Ribbon. Ugh. It's got like the consistency of suds and the alcoholic content of I don't know, 2 or 3%. It's lighter than light, But all these American kids get shit-faced on it, so I think it's in their head more than anything else. You give them a VB, they really go berserk. They loved it. Foster's, VB. And the thing about a Iroquois is that if you get a pallet of beer and you're very careful, you can slide it in and there's about like half an inch clearance all the way around and you can just slide it straight in. And with a pallet of bloody VB or any pallet of Australian beer, you can buy anything. Anything. That, and it didn't matter what rank they were. And of course I'm acting sub-lieutenant, but I could go in there with the beret on and my beard and aviator glasses and all the get-up, and they'd just take one of them and they go, bloody hell, what's going on here? Yeah, g'day, sir. How you going? What do you want? Oh, well, now you ask. Have you got any CBs were good? The Navy CBs. And they had a couple of big bases and they were real fabulous blokes. And they loved to have us come and visit. So we used to go and visit. And one of their bases was actually on the way home, Nah Bay. So if you had a bit of time, you'd go and land at Nah Bay. They had ammunition, they had, you could load up your chopper with all this stuff and fly on out. Because, nobody says when you've got to be home, you just got to be home. You know, I go, where have you been? Oh, well, I've been down the Delta. Where have you been? You know, you go off for the day, you come back. If you didn't show up after a few days, somebody would probably ask. It's weird shit, eh?
If you were well thought of.
I think they were more interested in the rest of the crew and their machine. No, they didn't care about anything. No, somewhere you'd do a head count and find out they come up short. It's just the weirdest thing, you know? And when I think about Vietnam, I think about all that sort of stuff. I don't think about the nasty shit. There was lots of it. But it doesn't do you any good to dwell on that stuff. I mean, you lose your mates. That was real bad. That made it like personal. I was still a co-pilot, and I was flying with the with an Australian in lead on a combat assault, and a guy I joined the Navy with was behind us, and he landed. This is my 21st birthday, and he landed on a command detonated mine. Just blew the helicopter right up, and really didn't do Dave much good either. And you know, we you know, stuff's happened. It was a hot LZ, so we flew out, and the gunships flew in, and so on and so forth. And you know, somebody went around and picked up Dave and the crew, and I don't even know who was the rest of the crew, but Dave was taken down to Canto Hospital, and I just remember we were, Peter Clark and myself, as soon as we were released for the day, we went down and picked him up, got him out of the hospital, just disconnected him from everything, and he was just lying in this sort of Vietnamese hospital, and he's not real well. Bits of him missing and stuff, and we put him on our chopper and flew max. We maxed out the whole way to Vung Tau, the Australian hospital. Called him up on the way in, clearance in, straight onto the pad, and that was the end of his war.
Can I ask you about, this is something that came up a few days ago with another Vietnam fella. He mentioned yippee shoots. Yippee shoots? Do you know that term at all? Oh, okay.
I don't think so. Yippee shoots.
Yippee shoots, yeah. I got, well, a strong impression that it was basically a shoot up that would happen in the spirit of moment where it was kind of what you were talking about before, where in kind of like the free fire zones, they'd go out and they'd find some VC and they'd just become a shooting gallery, basically.
Yeah. I'm familiar with what happened. I'm just not familiar with that term. That was not one we used.
Could have been from a different base, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, most likely. There's only, of the HFV, there was only 4 groups, and each group was around 45 or 48. So we're talking about less than 200 men for the whole war of Fleet Air Arm, and out of that, each group only had like 6 pilots or something like that. So we're talking about less than 30 pilots for the whole war. which it was a very small group. But there was lots of other, there was Air Force. Some Navy guys went to the Air Force, went to 9 Squadron, because especially early in the piece they didn't have enough people. So we had Navy blokes go to the Air Force on secondment. Yeah, and then of course there was all the Army and all the Air Force. There was lots of Air Force blokes working for, seconded to all kinds of different American Air Force and all sorts of stuff going on. We weren't the only secondments, we were just one of them.
Can you give us a bit of a, because you're the first fellow we've spoken to who was based at Bearcat, so can you give us a bit of a picture on what the scale of that place was like and who was there? I mean, it's a Thai base, but...
Well, it had, you know, God, I don't know, it was probably, it was a fair sized base. Two or 3 square miles, big. It had at least 2 airstrips, heaps of people on it. Southeast of Saigon. Can't.
Guess what was the ratio of personnel on the base in terms of, say, you know, Australians, Americans?
Oh, well,
Thai?
I don't know. It was a Thai base. I never saw the whole base from the ground. You know, you'd go to the PX and you'd go to the Cowboys. Well, there was a few aviation. The Cowboys were the 335th. There was other helicopter companies. There was a couple of Chinook companies, you know, and every now and then you'd hear there's a party on and you go down to their club and Yahoo all night. They'd have a show on or something like that. Absolutely no idea how many people. I mean, there could have been like 11,000 or 10,000 people there. There could have been like 2,000. I've got no idea. Thousands. But a big base, yeah.
And how did you guys get on with the Americans? I guess what was your opinion of them as fighters, I guess?
Well,
soldiers?
the other people in the company, the Americans in our company, that was, they were fine. We generally got on really well. Mostly because we tried to apply good humour to everything. And if it's one thing that everybody in the 135th will tell you, is that the humour, the Americans don't have, the Australians are very good at taking the piss, and Americans are really easy to, and we love doing it, eh? But they always took it in really good stead, you know, like every now and then you'd sort of get a little bit crossed wires and things like that, you know, but generally we all got on really well. The company itself had a lot of difficulty in Bearcat with heroin, Red Rock, and there was a lot of fairly high usage of heroin, which was pretty bad for the company, and we did go through a sort of pretty low period there. Because of that, and because they knew that it was happening so much, there was regular sort of sweeps done by the officers, and most of the American pilots were warrant officers, and they're just sort of hostilities only pilots. That's all they do. They're going in, they're going to become a pilot, and when there's no piloting, they don't do anything else. That's all they did. But for the warrant officers and the RLOs, real live officers, all lived together in the same area in the BOQ, Bachelor Officers' Quarters. Even the married guys lived. That's all there was. There's a BOQ. Yeah. And that, of course, created a schism between the officers and the men. And I found that really difficult. Like when I've got to go and look through somebody's foot locker and wall locker and upend his bed and stuff like that, and this is a guy who's going to be sitting behind me with an M60 tomorrow and covering my back, and I'm, that I found that really uncomfortable. Now, as an officer of the watch on the ship, was our duty to go through the mess decks and to make sure that there's only one sailor per bunk / hammock. Anzac was the last ship to have hammocks in the mess decks. That's one thing. As an officer, we had to do certain officer duties. One of them was to go through the hooch maid's hooch.
Andy, you were just talking to Chris before we switched tapes, telling him how it was your duty as an officer to clear out the mess halls, make sure there's one sailor. And then you were talking about the hoochie maids.
I was talking about, officers' duties.
Yeah.
And I was talking about about having to do the sweeps through the sailors and the army got that through their hooches. They're big double-storey buildings, and they all had their beds in a row and their foot lockers and their wall lockers and stuff like that. And I was saying that there's a real lot of officer duty that you just got to do, and I was quite happy to do all of these officer duties, but I was really uncomfortable with this, the searches, the drug searches, the drug sweeps. Now, whilst drugs is a real problem, and were then, they were a real problem. I had a lot of difficulty doing it, searching these guys' gear, when they're my crewmen and they're the guys that are covering my ass. They're the guys who are the crew chief of my aircraft tomorrow. They're the gunners. They're the guys who are looking after my back, and I'm treating them like sort of criminals. And I had a lot of difficulty with that. As I was saying, no problem with all these other duties that I'd performed, whilst I was an officer. But that particular drugs, terrible problem. I accept all of that, but having to search, doing that sort of search, ripping up, looking under their bunks and stuff like that, I hated it. And I knew that I had crewmen that were doing smack, Red Rock, little cubes, 99% pure, and held together with 1% arsenic. And it was the arsenic that used to get them, and had all sorts of, it's a poison that builds up in the system, and as it builds up, it has some really funny sort of side effects. And they used to inject it between their toes, under their eyelids, anywhere where they're not going to leave marks, and it's pretty horrible. But the worst thing is everybody knew who was doing it. I'm not saying me personally, but you could go up to the flight sergeant, like the sergeant in charge of that, of A flight, whatever it's called, first platoon sergeant. I'll get it right here in a minute. Yeah, you could go up to the platoon sergeant and say, all right, which one of these blokes, and he could tell you, but you still had to put up with this stuff, and I wasn't comfortable with that. I had some occasions where, backseat guys lost the plot. You'd have to quietly land somewhere and sort the mess out and take them home and say, this guy's lost it, we're not using him anymore. But
would he get sent back to Australia? Or
well, these are all Americans.
the Americans, or would he be sent back to the States?
Probably via the stockade. LBJ, Long Bin Jail. Yeah, not a pretty sight. But the Australians all drank. They could drink till they were oblivious. But the Americans preferred, some of them used to drink too, but the ones that really wanted to get out of it, it was Americans that used the other drugs. Pilots, one day there's a pilot there, next day he's gone. They go, what happened to him? Drugs, gone. So in fact that was, I believe, one of the major reasons why the company was moved from Bearcat to Dongtam. That and the fact that we were transiting from 3-core to 4-core every day to do our job, and we were flying so much, such heavy hours that they couldn't afford all the extra flight time getting to and from, getting up in Bearcat and flying down to Dongtam to start your day's work. So eventually they moved us to Dongtam, and we'd only been there a short while before the 3rd contingent came home.
What about you're a young bloke and you'd been training pretty non-stop for a couple of years before you headed off to Vietnam. Did you manage to find a girlfriend in between that time before going to Vietnam?
Yes, sort of.
In Australia?
Sort of. Yeah. A girl I wrote to. A couple actually.
Not at the same time, I'm assuming.
Well, it wasn't that, like when you say a girlfriend, it wasn't, it was just a girlfriend. There was I didn't have any serious commitment situation happening, and I certainly hadn't consummated any relationship. No. But the girls, a girl particularly, yeah.
What happened to her? And what about the nightlife in Saigon? I mean, this was the place where it all happened at night, wasn't it?
Yeah, I must have, the whole time I was there, I must have had, you know, only 2 or 3 nights in Saigon. I can't even think of a night in Saigon, but I must have had 1 or 2 nights in Saigon. 1 or 2 nights in, no, a few days / nights in Vung Tau. But I took my R&R in Taipei.
You mentioned wagon wheel before. What is a wagon wheel?
Oh, up near the wagon wheel. If you look at a map of South Vietnam, you will see at the south side of the plain of reeds, in a line between Vinh Long and Moc Qua. No, not Moc Qua. Directly to the north is this. There's a huge canal system, and there's about 6 canals that all go in like that. And when you look at it just looks like a big wagon wheel of all these canals all going into the one place. And the wagon wheel area was because of the big canals, was a major infiltration route for the bad guys, and they used the tree cover down along the canals, whereas away from the canals it was more just like reed beds, and so that's just it's like the parrot's beak. It's only that's where the Cambodian border comes down towards Cu Chi. And that was a particularly bad guy area as well, because they could hide in Cambodia, ostensibly outside Vietnam and therefore away from the Free World Forces. Except many of the Free World Forces took no notice of the Cambodian border and went across there anyway. And there were in fact some really big operations over the border.
That you were involved in?
No. Australians weren't allowed to go over the border. So in fact when they did a big operation in 1970, can't remember the name of it. It was, it was one of these huge, big pushes on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and the full length of it. And so everybody was involved, and they took all the heaps of troops over there, and they took every aviation company to put them in there, and our aviation company was involved, but they stripped every Australian out of it. It went away for a day and had to come back. It couldn't operate without the Australians, because we were, we were the C&C pilots, and we were the lead pilots, and we were the gunship pilots, and we were the crew chiefs, and we were the gunners, and this is not to disparage the Americans. I mean, there's supposed to be like 200 of us in the company, and of which about 50 is Australians. And there was a lot of talk about the profile of the Australians against the Americans, and we did in fact hold all the positions in a lot of cases, and that was quite simply because all the blokes that we took over had all been in the military longer than the Americans, other than senior people. I was a junior pilot, and yet I had 300 or 400 flight hours. They had guys there with nothing, 100 hours, like they didn't know how to fly. They had, they got all these these young guys, private PFC, you know, they've only been in the military 4 or 5, 6 months at the most. Whereas our blokes, heck, the most junior guy had been in for years. So when we went in and we headed up the maintenance teams, because our maintainers, our chief petty officer maintainers, had been doing it for 20 years or something, as against their guys, who were just like been there for a few months. You know, they had captains, army captains that had been in their army less time than I'd been in the Navy. But they had senior positions because they're captains. And I was nothing because I was a sub-lieutenant. In their speak, I started off as a butter bar, a yellow bar, which is an acting second lieutenant. And then I got a silver bar, which is a first lieutenant, which is sub-lieutenant in our Navy. And just the system. And of course they came and went and all that sort of stuff. Well, we just stayed. But we stayed as a group. And then at the changeover time, we all left. And a whole lot of newbies came, Australian newbies came in. But even as new guys, the maintainers just sort of went straight into doing what they do and what they've been doing for years. So they might be newbie in country, but they still had all this tremendous amount of experience, military experience, and as well as all the other kind of experience in their job. You know, engine blokes, airframes blokes, armourers who'd been armouring everything for years. So it was a case where you know, after we'd been there sort of a few months, we sort of naturally fell into, you know, motor pool officer and mess officers, and, you know, we sort of the titular head of all these different departments, you know, and like that just meant you went down there one day a week and signed things that the sergeant put under your nose and said, "Sign here, sir. Have we really got all these trucks?" "Yes, sir, we've got all these trucks."
Did you see a difference at all between the conscripted men from Australia and the men that joined up voluntarily? Did you come across that at all?
No, because there's no conscripts in the Navy. They're all volunteers.
Of course.
So there was we had no conscripts. We had army conscripts, but when we went and visited the army, you know, nobody says, "Oh, you know, like, don't talk to him, he's a conscript." I don't know how the army people were within the army, but as a visitor to their base at Nui Dat, you know, they're all army. They're all painted the same colour, you know, and we'd go down and drink in their messes and create a bit of havoc for the night and get up and try and wander off the next day.
From an archive point of view, well, from my point of view, it'd be good, I guess, to hear about, I guess, one of the bigger ones, or ones that, I guess, one that was particularly hairy for you in terms of what you were having to do and just how you negotiated through it.
A normal day in war. Now there's a contradiction in terms. A normal insertion a normal day of combat assaults is like up at 4, get your aircraft ready, you know, have breakfast, mount up, and away you go. And you take off as dawn's happening, and you wander off down to where they've detailed you to go to pick up the troops. And you land, the troops get on. In the meantime, the command and control ships, CNC ships, landed, picked up the bosses, gone off to have a look at the area, the gunships have already gone over there to have a bit of a mosey around, and if the gunships take any fire from the ground, then they will concentrate on that, but otherwise they might prep the area, which means put in rockets and small arms fire, miniguns and things like that, smaller 7.62 rounds, 40 millimeters and little. Some of the gunships had 40 millimeter grenade launchers in their nose. But yeah, they'd prep the area, and the slicks would arrive. The area would be marked by smoke, and depending on the area, depending on whether you've got opposition, you go in hot. Not only all guns blazing, but nice and fast. And you whack your troops on the ground, and then you pick it all up and away you go, and you keep doing that till all the troops are in there. Sometimes you find the LZs sort of, there'd be no opposition. You wouldn't even fire around going in, you just go inland, let everybody out, and everything is pretty cool. But sometimes you'd be going into an area where there was serious opposition, and you have to take your troops in, take your flight in, and get all your flight on the ground, all the troops out of the helicopters, and then get them all back again into the air and out. On occasion you run into some pretty heavy fire, ground fire, and sometimes it's in the form of heavy anti-aircraft. Well, the heaviest we ran into was 50 millimeter, which is some pretty, that'll 50 millimeter will chop a helicopter out of the sky in just like no time at all. Usually if the LZ was highly contested, you'd have a lot of fixed wing support aircraft as well as the helicopter gunships. The support aircraft carrying a lot of things like 5 millimeter Zuni rockets and napalm bombs, 20 millimeter cannon and that sort of stuff. And they used to set up their runs from altitude, and the whole thing was coordinated by a command and control helicopter, which is usually just flying around in a orbit over the top of the area of operations. Not all days, not all operations were with large groups of troops or large groups of helicopters. There was lots of operations where you were dealing with special operations people, SEALs, special forces, snake eaters they're called, because they'll eat anything when they're in there. Yeah, special operations jobs were always a bit different.
In what
I
way?
remember one where they wanted to grab some bad guys, and they knew which hooches, which huts they were actually in, and we flew a team of SEALs, and there was a SEAL group they're Navy SEALs, and they're like SAS, and in fact this SEAL team had SAS with them, Often the SEAL teams would also have, well not also, but would have our clearance divers with them, because the clearance divers are handle. They do booby traps and they do munitions. They're good at all that sort of stuff. They take it apart and put it together, and they swim underwater. Once you get into special operations, there's a whole range of things, and we had people working in all of those areas. And we as a aviation company worked with them as well. And for instance, this SEAL team wanted to go and pick up some bad guys. They had a photograph of the, aerial photograph of the hooches, and we were to land. We were to fly in very fast, low level, throw the choppers down in the grass right in front of the hooch, pick the choppers up, hover taxi over to the other side, put them down in the grass on the other side of the hooch. The guys are supposed to jump out, run through the hooches, grab the people they're supposed to grab, run out the other side, jump on the helicopters and be gone. That's the theory. Except these bad guys had heaps of their friends there, all in the grass and hanging around and one thing and another. So when we threw it on the ground in front of the hooches, all these blokes come dancing out, firing their guns and in your face. I mean, and a lot of it, this is where it becomes really personal, because it's one thing to sort of fly along and look down and somebody goes bang, that doesn't happen usually like that. What happens is you land and then suddenly you realise that these guys sitting in this hole right in front of you are bad guys, and they're shooting at you, and you're sitting in this very slow aluminum and plexiglass piece of equipment that anybody with an air rifle can shoot holes in, much less automatic weapons, and yeah, that's what they do. In this case, they all just jumped up and they started hosing the helicopters, and all the SEALs jumped out and hosed back, and we picked it up and went over the side. And yeah, we flew out with the bad guys, and we took a lot of hits, and you think, wow, how did they miss? And you look at all these holes in the windscreen, and you think, like, bloody hell, it's personal. And that happens often when, like you're just the pilot. I'm just the pilot, them guys in the back, they're the grunts, they're the ones that are playing war games. We're just carrying them around. But yeah, often it used to be brought home to you in the strongest possible manner that there's a war on, and there's bad guys, and they don't like you. And there's even special medals that they're given if they can shoot a helicopter down, and so on. So they just delight in shooting at helicopters. And it's amazing how many times you can be hit without actually landing in and balling it up in a blaze. There are, like you've probably heard of the golden BB. It's possible to be hit with one BB round that'll put you completely out of action and finish up on the ground in a big heap. All they've got to do is hit the right spot, and it's remarkable. In fact, one of the things about the Huey or the Bell 205 A1, one of the amazing things is the amount of punishment it can take and still keep flying.
And what's the most vulnerable spot, probably apart from the pilot?
Well, the plates, you know, if you get a whack in the transmission or in the engine, around through the turbines or through the compressor will probably do the trick, yeah. But there's a hell of a lot of fuselage and a lot of airspace and blades and things like that, you know. Like I've seen holes in main rotor blades you could put your head up through, things still flying. I've had a blade with a couple of feet missing off the ends, it'll fly. Not real well, but it'll get you out of there.
And, I mean, did you know that it had been hit at the time? Can you feel it in
Yes. Oh, well, sometimes, absolutely. You know, when the bloody instrument panel gets all these holes come in it, you know, because somebody's standing in front of you having a go at you, it's obvious. You can tell you've been hit. But there's lots of places you can take around and you wouldn't even know it. And indeed, some places that are critical, but you wouldn't know it unless something comes loose.
Were there any times during ops where it was a very close call and you were a bit worried you weren't going to make it back?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh, I got involved in a major operation where, when I say, you know, some of these landing zones were contested, usually you'd get all the way down to the ground and some bad guy would jump up on the edge and go bang, you know, and sometimes he'd have some of his mates and they'd all go bang, you know, and you think, oh wow, this is not very nice. But you knew things were really bad when minutes from touchdown you're still 1,000 feet on approach and you're already taking fire. Not only that, you're taking hits. 1,000 feet on approach. That's a long way to fly, to come all the way down and land, unload, and then take off and get out again. That's a hell of an exposure, and that means that there's a real lot of them and they're really well armed and they're really determined. And yeah, I ran into that situation. That particular situation was probably one of the worst I was involved in. May 18, 1970. And I'd already finished a day's work and I was going home, and usually when you were going home and there was nothing much going on, you'd dial up on the company frequency and have a bit of a listen, see what the boys were doing. I mean, sometimes they'd already be home and other times they'd be, you know, quiet. You know, what are you guys doing? Oh, we're sitting over here on the edge of an airfield and we're going home soon. And in this particular case, the boss said, oh, come on down here. You know, the flight lead, we've already lost him. He's already been shot up and had to depart the scene, and he's sitting on some airfield somewhere. Poor old Dick Marham. He was lucky bugger, eh? He put a ship down that was out of hydraulics or something on the end of the runway, only to look up and there was a C-123 landing. And they had to jump out of their helicopter and run away, and the friggin' 123 just ran right over the top of them. Yeah, only this particular time, it'd taken there was a lot of ground fire, and it had severed his, I don't know if he took a hit in the helmet or just had gone through the cord, severed the cord so he couldn't talk to anybody. And if you can't talk to your crew and you can't talk to the CNC, you know, that's no good. You can't do that. You've got to have communications or you're completely, you can't operate. So anyway, yeah, I went down there and I was flight lead, and we'd lost so many ships already that they'd called up this other company, and they'd called up a couple of other companies, and we went in with a make-up flight And after the first insertion, these other boys, they said, no, we're not going to do that. We're out of here. And so they just went home. They said, we're not going to do that anymore. So I got some more choppers together. They, detailed off some more choppers, and I went in again. And it was the same all over again. And it was pretty bloody frightening. There was lots and lots of bad shit happening, and we landed right in the middle of it. And for instance, the first load of troops, I don't even think any of them made it 10 feet from the helicopter, because there was a machine gun emplacement right in front of where I landed. Right in front, so that when I landed, I'm just like sitting there looking at him, and he just blew the front of my helicopter away, and windscreens and chin bubbles and bits and pieces of lots of stuff flying around inside, and I'm trying to make myself invisible. And I took some hits, not body hits. One went through the side of my boot, and I had a lot of plexiglass bits. So I'm going, oh, I'm hit, And I said to the co-pilot to take over. He said, no, I'm hit too. I thought, give it back to me, So, we were back in business, and I flew out of there again. But that was huge. And there was a lot of people involved there too. But they had some really heavy guns in there, because the boss he said, I'm at 5,000 feet and I'm climbing, and they're still firing at me. Like he's going up and I'm going down. Oh, we left. There was aircraft all over the bloody place, because that's it. All you want to do is get away, You get away to the closest fire base, the closest airfield, somewhere that's like almost safe. And so, if you can get there without the whole thing, letting you down into because at night especially, you don't want to be walking around in the bush. It's not good. Not good. It might be all right for grunts and those sort of people, but it's not. Don't care how many Canungra courses you've done, it's not for me. Those people, those grunts, they're amazing. They get on the chopper and they're all laughing and carrying on, and you let them off and they're all still laughing as they're running out. Who'd be a grunt? Amazing. Yeah. So, I got involved in some really big stuff. That one I was telling you about there, May 18, the Cougar 6, which is the battalion CO. He was down there because all his boys were having all this stuff happening, so he was around. And he put me up for the American Silver Star. Took a lot of years to get it, but I got that eventually. A lot of years. The Australian government, the Queen, doesn't recognise foreign decorations. End of story. Having said that, all sorts of foreign decorations were awarded and received and acknowledged, but just the official line. And it really depended on who your boss was, as how you sort of went with that. And it's taken years. As I said to you before, like we were entitled to receive our air medals because the US military award air medals for, combat air missions. And we're still arranging for the guys, the gunners and crew chiefs, Navy blokes, to get their air medals. And like lots of them have got one, because you get a number. You used to get little somethings. You get that, and you get on it. You get little, I don't know whether they were stars or oak leaves or cluster something. But now you get a number, and a lot of our boys did a lot of flying, you know, that they're never going to get sort of recognised for. But, you know, you get one air medal, that'll do. It's like mine, you know, like, I don't know whether the numbers, I don't think the numbers, well, the number's not right, but that's not the issue. I don't care anymore. You know, what am I going to argue about a number for? Finally got some air medals. It doesn't, it's not a big deal in a lot of ways, but in other ways, here's a you know, the biggest military organisation. No, it's not the biggest military organisation in the world, but in the free world it is. And if they're going to give you, you know, a well done for a job, and your government says, "Oh no, you're not allowed to do that," you know. But it's nice if you can. And finally, only in the last few years, has our government recognised these foreign decorations. So like I said, the boys are still, as we speak, they're still sort of lining up to receive these.
Well, there's nothing wrong with getting recognised for a job well done.
No, well, it's not like we made a lot of money or anything in those days, you know, not like now where they get huge bonuses, you know, for going anywhere. In those days, that didn't happen. And I mean, the Australian government was flat out equipping their forces, and indeed they're still flat out equipping their forces, you know, and I'm not talking about bloody Star Wars or Collins class submarines. I'm talking about bullets. You know, they went into Timor with no bullets. You know, when you came off patrol, you gave the other guy all your gear, you know, and all your bullets so that he could have them if he needed them. You know, the stories are legion. When I was in Washington a few years ago, this old boy came up to me and he was telling me this story, and in fact he asked me to spread the word around the Australian Army. He's got 2 pairs of brand new Australian Army GP boots that he's never worn. And he's kept them because he received them in a box somewhere up in I-Corps, because months previously there was this big operation down in 3 Corps, and they'd rounded up all these aviation companies and they were landing and all these troops were getting on, and he turned around and he said, "What's this?" He said, "All these funny looking troops are getting on, you know, and like they're in their giggle hats and the green gear, you know. There's no camouflage gear or anything like that. They're all just in, you know, the green and a bit of webbing and a water can, and that's it. An SLR each. No grenades, no smoke, no extra ammunition, no nothing. And they're off on an insertion to fight the bad guys." And he said he couldn't believe it. So he got the gunner and the crew chief to empty out all their grenades and smokes and 1,000 rounds of ammunition, and these guys were, because the 7.62 is the same whether it's bloody loose or clipped. So these guys are taking it off the belts and putting it in all their pockets and stuff like that. No, it was a big shit fight. I can't remember which one that was. But these guys had nothing. And these guys were so happy to have got some ammunition and everything to jump out of this aircraft and do the business, that they got his name off the back of his helmet. They knew which company it was, and and he wants to find those blokes. He wants to find them. But that's just a story, another story about, you know, how our blokes have been detailed off to do a mission and haven't had the gear to do it with. And
there seem to be quite a few of those.
the theatres of operation changed, but otherwise nothing else does. And again, you know, they just don't. Somewhere up the line, somebody just doesn't give a shit. They'd rather have Son of Star Wars.
Can I ask you, Andy, although this sort of seems a bit of an obvious question, given everything we talked about in terms of the chaos of Vietnam, but rules of engagement. I knew you were going to laugh.
What's your question?
What sort of things did you see of them kind of going out the window, I guess, in the chaos of battle, or fellas having
Yes,
to
well, the rules of
survive?
engagement were pretty well laid down for Vietnam. There was occasions when people stepped so far outside the line they finished up in serious trouble, as they should have. The fact is that in a situation where it can be really difficult to tell the difference between a farmer and a Viet Cong, in a situation where a lot of the farmers are Viet Cong and a lot of the Viet Cong are farmers. I mean, the Viet Cong were the local blokes. Sure, NVA regulars, a lot of them had uniforms or bits of uniforms, and some of them were like fully uniformed, and you knew, you know, who the fair dinkum blokes were with the flash uniforms, and you knew that they'd come all the way from up north. But when you're dealing with the local blokes who are farmers during the day and Viet Cong at night, then it can be really difficult. And when you have, during the night, got involved in a really big blue somewhere, and you go out there the next day and there's just a heap of farmers, you think, like any war where there's not been lines drawn, the line of, where there's no lines drawn, then that's when definitions become elastic. And that goes right throughout, you know, whether it be, is this Cambodia or Vietnam? Oh, I don't know. It's the, you know, like, and who gives a shit what's more, you know? Like, they're firing at us, we'll return the compliment. That line, you know, and then the line of, you know, do we fire at him or do we not? You know, well, let's, you know, the rules of engagement says that, you know, unless he's armed or, you know, or running, you know, does he look like a bad guy, you know? And what are you going to, the boss is saying, does he look like a bad guy? What are you, flying around at like 500 feet and you think, oh, he looks like a bad guy from here. What, you know? Yeah, there's probably lots of times when all those lines got crossed. It's inevitable. It's war, and war's always worst on civilians, women and kids. No question, when especially in a war like that. And and you can try all you damn like, but today in Afghanistan, there's a big piece in the paper about, you know, a bunch of women and kids got killed, you know, and there's not even a war going on. Or maybe it's just the ongoing war on terror.
But there are occasions in Vietnam, well, I believe quite common of you know, where VC would be women and children.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, it would get very blurry, I would imagine.
Well, I mean, sometimes the VC you thought was a VC turns out to be a friendly after they're dead. And sometimes the friendly turns out to be a VC when they whip a piece out and let fly at you, you know. And there's little kids who are indoctrinated to the point where, you know, they're going to have a go regardless of whether they think they're safe or not, you know. Really, it comes down to sort of how bad you're puckering at the time, and that if you're real twitchy and you're in a real bad area, and there's known bad people around, you're more likely to fire first and ask questions later. If you're going down the main street of Saigon, you're far less likely to, and there's just as many VC there. I mean, for Christ's sake, everybody knew that Vung Tau was not only our rest area, but was Vietnamese NVA rest area as well. And very little happened right in Vung Tau because nobody wanted your rest area to be messed up. It's madness, you know. Up in Laos, the Americans operated out of one side of the field and the Russians operated out of the other. And the Russians would go off and support the path at Laos, and the Americans would go off and support the bloody Free Lao forces, or whatever they were called on the day. And they're all operating out of the same airfield and drinking in the same bars. Cambodia, similar sort of story. There's what line?
Well, exactly.
You know, and that's part of what I was saying. It's all part of the madness of it.
And what about fellas who, I mean, because of all of that, didn't, for want of a better word, obviously didn't deal with it terribly well. I mean, what did you come across any fellas who kind of lost it, I guess?
Yeah.
And what sort of things would they do, or how would they lose it, I guess is the question.
Well, you know, stop firing now. I think all that mob down there are civilians. And when you've got to say that 2 or 3 times and there's a lot of civilian dead people who could be VC too, you know, except some of those kids are a bit young to be VC. And you go, what was all that about? You know, steady down. Get a grip. Yeah, people lost it. People went screaming off, and it's what happens. It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy when things happen to people you know, like part of your crew has lost the plot Otherwise, it's a statistic. And there were lots of times when it became personal. And if you let it become too personal, it could really mess you around. And so you tried to. That's where you desensitise yourself more and more. And then you get to the point where you don't give a shit. You know, and that's where that expression killed a lot of them, but God sorted them out. I can't tell you how many times I heard that.
In some ways, it's a matter of survival.
Well,
Like-
that's what it gets down to.
Yeah.
It gets down to personal survival. You don't give a shit about the politics anymore. And we can sit back here now and talk about the politics. But back then, I mean, politics has got nothing to do with it. You know, I hadn't voted, for Christ's sake. I wasn't allowed to drink in some states, and I couldn't vote anywhere in the country. Too young. So politics didn't even come into it for me. I wasn't a political being at all at that time. I'd got to the point though where I did know about personal survival. And at certain levels, that wasn't just the personal survival of going out and being in the war environment, doing the job out there. Sure, there was a whole lot of personal survival issues out there, but inside the headspace, you know, and I've got to tell you, I didn't even think about it. But on reflection, yeah, you do all these things to get by.
Is it a matter of the further you remove yourself and just shut it off, the safer you are?
Yeah. And I think everybody's the same. I think everybody, you can't be sitting there, you know, crouched over a weapon and firing it into people, and taking it personally in the sense that, oh God, you know, like, you can't. They're the bad guys, we're the good guys, and you know, this is what we're doing. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We'll have to switch tapes again.
Right. So you were there for 10.5 months. What happened? Did someone just come and say, all right, Andy, we've had enough. You've had enough. See you later? What was there?
No. As I said, I went up as a replacement, and that happened like that. 1 minute I'm down the squadron, and within a couple of days, no pre-embarkation leave or anything like that. Within a couple of days, I was on the flight and gone. Everybody else got pre-embarkation leave and all that sort of stuff, but I didn't have that opportunity. Coming home is different. Everybody knows when we're coming home because it's a published date way in advance of when it's going to happen, because the Australians transferred as a group. I mean, the actual day of whatever it was, October the something or other, was, we just knew that it was within a few days of when we were going to be leaving. Yeah.
So what were your thoughts about coming home? Do you think you were prepared at that time? Like, I've had enough, thank God, I'm coming home, or...
Yep.
Right.
I tried to go back because I was offered, whilst I was up there, I was offered a couple of jobs up there. And I approached a friendly government whilst I was still in this country, and that was the wrong thing to do. I should have left the country, but I didn't actually go back to Vietnam. I went back to Southeast Asia later.
But before you left to come home from Vietnam, you'd met that bloke that said, when you're through with this mess, come and see me. Is that right?
Yes.
And he was the guy that you started out working for after you got out of the Navy?
Yes.
What were your thoughts then about when you were coming home? Did you have a feeling then that you'd stay in the Navy?
I fully expected to. The attitude of Australia and of the Navy when I got back, I must say, amazed me. I couldn't believe that I couldn't believe it. You know, that was one thing, because I knew the Australian public was not happy. The personal confrontations that I had because of that were upsetting enough, but what I found the more upsetting was the Navy's attitude. They promised much and gave nothing. I was really, that's what upset me the most, the Navy's attitude, and people within the Navy. Because, and we touched on this before, you've got a whole Navy here full of people. You've got a whole Fleet Air Arm full of pilots, some of whom are Korea War veterans. The Navy's, the HMAS Sydney got the record for the number of operations off its decks in any 24-hour period. Nobody before or since beat it. The Navy are really good at what they do in that regard. And a lot of the old boys dine out on the stories. And then there's a whole gap. There's the FESR, Far East Strategic Reserve, and mostly that was ships. I don't know how many Fleet Air Arm people got involved in any kind of air operations to do with the Indonesian confrontation Malay thing. We did have ships involved in that, but I don't know if there was any, like I say, Fleet Air Arm involvement, other than helicopters taking off, sitting out the front of the ships looking for communist submarines, you know, in the South China Sea, admittedly. But I'm talking about full-on warlike operations. So the next fight was Vietnam. And by now a fair bit of time's passed. We're talking about late 60s, when Korea was the early 50s. But it's still within a lot of naval people's time in the Navy, because the Navy tends to keep people, you know, for a long time. I mean, the short-term commission, which was what I was on, is 9 years. That's short. So, you know, the idea is you stay in. But anyway, so you've got a situation where it's been a while since we've had a proper war, and now we've had a proper war, and bloody hell, look who we've sent. Bunch of young helicopter pilots, for Christ's sake. You know, and even then there's only a few of them. You know, even in our Navy, which has bugger all people in it, less than 30 pilots, doesn't even make up a squadron, does it? All of them together. So, you know, like we amounted to nothing in their estimations of what the Navy was about. All the more so because it had nothing to do with the Navy. Sure, the Navy were asked by the government to supply people, but it had nothing to do with the Navy where they went. It wasn't a Navy organisation, it was somebody else's army, for Christ's sake, not even in this country. So, but nevertheless, there was a certain amount of, I believe, professional jealousy. I strongly believe in that, because there was a lot of much more senior officers, Navy pilots than me, who could have done it, but weren't in the position to do it, weren't asked to do it. They never got to be able to put their hand up. And hell, this bog rat just come in off the street and he went, you know.
Can I talk to you a little bit on the personal note for a minute about getting over the feeling screwed up from Vietnam? How did you overcome that? You mentioned to Chris earlier that you went bush at some point.
Well, I was lucky that my job could take me away, and it did. And you know, I worked as a pilot in the bush, in the jungle, in the jungles, in other countries. There's not a lot of jungle in this country. But I found I was spending longer and longer getting over each trip. I've never worked for anybody for very long after the Navy. There was a few jobs, but usually, and towards the end, you know, like I was freelancing and just doing a contract at a time, and I was finding that I was taking longer between contracts to be able to go out and do the next one. And I would spend a very long time sitting in the jungle on my front veranda of the little house that I built in a clearing. Longer and longer, preparing to go away again, and not looking forward to it. And when I would get a contract, it was always best if they wanted me to go straight away, because my wife used to complain that once they said I was gone, I was to go, I would just, in my head, I would be already gone. And I would be, you know, a lot of the jobs were, you know, go to the airport, get on this plane, go to that airport, get on another plane, go to this country. You know, the bloke will pick you up and take you, and you will find the helicopter there and go and do this job. Or, you know, it might be, you know, fly into this big operation and there's a whole bunch of people there and we want you to do that job. Yeah, it took me longer and longer to get myself together, and then when I come back, it would take me longer and longer to talk to people.
Can I just ask you, sorry, what was happening here though? You're getting depressed, more and more depression and anxiety.
Yeah, and agoraphobia. I didn't want to go out. I was just having difficulty with the world, and when I went out there, I'd often get in blues.
Right, you'd be looking for a fight, or you'd just be eager to defend yourself and get into one? Both?
Oh, you never go looking for a fight, but it's pretty easy to get one if you're a bit prickly about stuff. You know, if you're laid back and let it all flow over you, you know, that doesn't matter what people do, but if you're a bit prickly, it's easy to get into an argument, especially with dickheads. You know, and like more and more nowadays, I just try and let them pass me by without comment. You know, just sort of tick that one off. I don't ever talk to that one again. You know, but there have been occasions when they just aggravate me by their mere existence. You've got to say something and get involved.
Is that, do you think, because people judge you before they know you?
Oh, not necessarily. It's just that, no, although I've had that. I've had bosses, potential bosses, so that, you know, when they find out I'm a Vietnam veteran, there's no way, and they've said it to my face, there's no way I'm going to employ a Vietnam veteran. You're all mad. And I've had the "you're all mad and you're not going to work here" any number of times. And that's not very nice.
I'm not quite sure what to say to that. That's silly.
Well, yeah, and you know, anybody who's that stupid, you don't want to have much to do with, and when they're supposed to be the boss of the organisation, you go, oh, well, you know, do I really need to be out here? I'm poor, I'm broke, I need the money, but, you know, how long am I going to last with somebody who thinks like that? I'm going to punch them in the head because they absolutely deserve it. Hence, what I was saying before, stress.
Did alcohol play a big part in your
Yes.
post-war life?
War life,
War life.
Navy life, yes.
So from go to woe?
But particularly during and after Vietnam. Like I said to you before, my friend and mentor killed himself with alcohol, and I quit the Navy and quit drinking. I actually quit drinking a couple of times, obviously because I took it up again, but I quit the Navy and quit drinking because it frightened me, because I thought that I was going to go the same way. And a few times I've thought I was going to go the same way. So alcohol's a bad one. It's a very insidious drug. And it's been the ruination. It's ruined many a good man. Ruined. I've got to throw in a bit of levity because, you know, like you can't, otherwise, just, you know, it's serious.
I know.
Yeah. But yeah, I've had to quit drinking a few times. And now I can't really drink at all. I do drink, but now I just drink because I like the flavour. But I can't get drunk, doesn't matter how much I drink, so I don't bother.
Okay, I've got one more question for you. What about associations and Anzac Day? That's kind of two questions, actually.
Associations. This last year I've not renewed my subscription to the RSL. I hadn't for years. When I was really sick and needed a advocate that was supplied by the RSL, and he was a good old boy, and he said it'd be politic to pay my dues to the RSL. Fair enough. So for a few years I did. But I don't go there. I don't like it. I don't like a lot of the attitudes. I don't like a lot of the. I don't like the. There's a real lot of stuff I don't like about the RSL. The organisation, the way it runs its clubs. The RSL is a multi-million-dollar club running organisation. There's 5% of it probably has something to do with looking after the old diggers, but essentially it's really about running gambling clubs, which they have almost a captive audience, and especially when you consider that they run out a free bus to the homes to truck in the blue rinsed old ladies who can sit there with a fag hanging out of their face feeding their pension into the slots. Personally, I hate slot machines. I'm not a gambler, not in that sense. I've said to people, you know, I'll gamble my life, but I wouldn't gamble my money. I have no interest in gambling, and my wife's a gambler and she's won heaps of money, you know, and thanks very much.
But I mean, Australians
The winnings are good.
Australians have a whole culture though of
Drinking and gambling and smoking
drinking and
sitting in
gambling.
the corner of RSL clubs. Yeah, well, I've never been part of that. My father was never part of that. He was probably a lifetime member. Not in the. He wasn't like a life member, but the whole of his life he was probably a member of the RSL, the local RSL. But it was different back then. These giant multi-million-dollar clubs, it's not any kind of RSL thing. And it's not. Once upon a time, it was for returned servicemen. You know, now because of the money they require, anybody you can go down and join up. You know, pay you $10, you're in. You know, and I'm a member of the TPI Association, and those old boys over there, they do a good job. They do a lot of work, and it's a good job. I'm a member of the Fleet Air Arm Association because all my old mates, you know, in the Fleet Air Arm, it's the only way to stay in touch with some of them. I'm a member of the Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association, which is an American organisation. And that's another good way to get in touch or stay in touch with a lot of my American friends. And I would say that I stay in touch with more Americans than I do Australians. But as I was saying before, the 135th emus have the biggest and best network, especially via the internet. I believe, or my understanding is, of any Vietnam aviation company. We have more of the old boys have stayed in touch. And one of my friends, one of my old crew chiefs, has just finished rebuilding a helicopter and completely a Huey with all the right colour scheme and all the right signs and everything on it, and it's a flying museum piece.
And now, what about Anzac Day, Andy? What are your feelings about marching on Anzac Day?
Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Usually I will go to the dawn service. It's rare I miss a dawn service. And when I do go, I always go with my wife. And if my son's there, he always comes as well. He's good. And march, once upon a time I wouldn't know. Now I've marched like 2 or 3 times. I've got to be really feeling good about the day if I'm going to march. A lot of times I'm just happy to stay home, thanks very much. Again, there's a lot of people out there. And if I can get over that hurdle of facing a lot of people, then I can go along. But there's a real lot of things I don't do. One of them is I don't really do crowds. Very uncomfortable in crowds. And if I don't have to, often it's easier not to. Yeah. If I've got a bunch of mates saying, oh, we're all going to march, you ought to come down, no, and you go, oh yeah, right, yeah. And if they ring up a week beforehand and G me up, and then the night before, and especially if one of them says, I'm going to come round and get you, then all right, I'll do it. But you know, like they've got to bloody sneak up on me with that.
They have to work on you a bit.
Yeah, yeah.